Most people believe productivity is about doing more. High performers know something different, and it is almost never talked about directly. Productivity is not about doing more. It is about doing the few things that actually count and ignoring almost everything else on purpose. Here is the pattern almost nobody sees. Busyness and productivity feel identical from the inside. Both involve effort. Both involve a full calendar. Both involve the sensation of being pulled in 6 directions at once, answering messages, attending meetings, moving through a list. If you ask someone in the middle of either state to describe how it feels, they would probably use the same words: tired, stretched, behind, in demand. But from the outside, the two states produce completely different results. One person spends 10 hours a day in motion and ends the year in roughly the same place they started. Another person spends far fewer hours, appears calmer, sometimes even looks like they are doing less, and ends the year with outcomes the first person never touches. Same input of effort, wildly different output of results. Most people miss this entirely. They assume the difference must be talent, or luck, or resources. It is usually none of those things. The difference is what each person counted as real work. Here is the hidden principle. Busyness is optimized for motion. Productivity is optimized for leverage. Motion is any activity that makes you feel like you are working. Leverage is action that actually moves the outcome you care about. These are not the same thing. And the confusion between them is one of the most expensive mistakes a capable person can make. Think about what motion actually rewards. Motion rewards visibility. If you are in 5 meetings today, everyone can see it. If you answered 40 emails before lunch, there is a paper trail. If you stayed late, someone noticed you leaving the building after dark. Motion is easy to measure, easy to display, and easy to feel proud of. This is exactly why so many competent people default to it. It offers the emotional reward of effort without the risk of judgment. Leverage is the opposite. Leverage often looks like almost nothing is happening. A person spends 90 minutes thinking clearly about which of 3 projects deserves the entire company's attention this quarter and eliminates the other 2. From the outside, this looks like sitting quietly at a desk. There is no meeting to point to, no inbox emptied, no visible motion at all. But that 90 minutes may be worth more than 400 hours of everyone else's activity combined, because it changed what everyone else's activity was aimed at. This is the trap. Most people think doing less looks weak. Successful people understand that doing less when it is the right less is the entire advantage. Have you noticed that the people who seem to accomplish the most are often the calmest people in the room? That is not an accident of temperament. It is a downstream effect of how they have already filtered their day. They are not calm because they have fewer demands on their time. They are calm because they have already decided which demands do not deserve a response. The business is gone before it starts, filtered out at the decision point, not survived through gritted teeth in the moment. Here is where the deeper confusion sits. Busyness disguises itself as diligence. It borrows the costume of hard work. Staying late looks like commitment. Responding instantly to every message looks like reliability. Filling a calendar looks like being in demand, which looks like being important. None of these things are wrong exactly, but none of them are leverage either. They are performances of effort that can exist entirely separately from whether anything meaningful got moved forward. This is the part almost nobody sees, because busyness is never announced as busyness. It always shows up wearing the mask of responsibility. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I will do a lot of pointless activity." They wake up and say, "Today I have a lot to do," and then they do all of it with equal urgency, as if urgency itself were the measure of importance. But urgency and importance are 2 separate scales, and most people never separate them. An email marked urgent might have 0 bearing on anything that matters in 6 months. A quiet, unscheduled hour of deep thinking about a single decision might determine the outcome of the entire year. If you only respond to what feels urgent, you will spend your life reacting to other people's priorities instead of advancing your own. This is why the pattern is counterintuitive. Most people assume that the busiest person in the room must be the most productive one, because busyness looks like proof of work. But busyness is not evidence of impact. It is evidence of motion, and motion without leverage is simply exhaustion with good posture. Once you see this distinction, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing it everywhere. The colleague who is always slammed but never seems to finish anything that changes the trajectory of their work. The executive who cancels half their meetings and somehow moves faster than everyone attending them. The pattern is consistent. Busyness fills time, leverage changes outcomes, and almost nobody is taught to tell the difference because our entire culture rewards the appearance of effort long before it ever checks the results of that effort. What changes when you finally see this? You stop measuring your day by how full it was. You start measuring it by what actually moved. That single shift, small as it sounds, is the foundation of everything high performers do differently, and it is where the real explanation begins. If leverage is so much more valuable than motion, a fair question follows immediately. Why doesn't everyone simply choose leverage? Why do capable, intelligent people who clearly understand the difference in theory still spend most of their day drowning in motion anyway? This is where the pattern gets uncomfortable, because the answer is not about time management. It is about what busyness actually protects people from. Busyness is not just a bad habit. For most people, it is a shelter. It hides something that feels far riskier than staying late or answering every email. The responsibility of deciding what matters most and living with being wrong about it. Here is the mechanism. The moment you choose the one project, the one relationship, the one skill that deserves your full attention, you have also implicitly chosen everything else as less important. That decision is exposed. It can be judged. If you commit fully to the wrong priority, everyone, including you, will eventually see the miscalculation clearly. There will be no crowd of 100 small tasks to hide inside. There will be one visible bet, and it either worked or it did not. Busyness removes that exposure entirely. If you spend your day on 40 small things, no single decision can be blamed for a disappointing outcome. You were doing everything you could. Nobody can point to the one call you made because you never really made one. You spread the risk so thin that no individual choice carries enough weight to be judged. This feels safe. It is also the exact reason busyness rarely produces anything remarkable. Most people never notice this trait because it happens below conscious awareness. Nobody sits down and thinks, I will fill my day with meaningless tasks to avoid the discomfort of prioritizing. Instead, the mind simply gravitates toward whatever feels most urgent in the moment, because urgency provides an easy, ready-made excuse for where the day went. The inbox becomes the priority list, not because it is the most important thing, but because it is the loudest thing, and responding to loud things requires no real judgment at all. There is a name for this underlying instinct. Call it the exposure avoidance pattern. The mind consistently prefers actions that reduce visible risk over actions that maximize actual outcome, even when the second path is clearly better in theory. This is not laziness. It is often the opposite. Some of the hardest working, most anxious, most conscientious people fall hardest into this pattern because their effort is real. It is simply aimed at the wrong target. Comfort through motion rather than results through leverage. This is the part almost nobody sees. Busyness is frequently not a failure of discipline. It is a very disciplined avoidance of a harder emotional task, sitting with the discomfort of narrowing your focus and being accountable for that narrow bet. Consider how this shows up in something as ordinary as a to-do list. A person writes down 15 tasks for the day. 10 of them are small, safe, easily checkable. 2 of them are medium. 3 of them are the tasks that would actually change something meaningful if completed, and those 3 are also the most uncertain, the most likely to be judged, the most emotionally loaded. Guess which ones get done first, and which ones quietly slide to tomorrow, then the next day, then get rewritten on a fresh list a week later, still undone. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a character flaw. It is a predictable response to uncertainty. The brain is wired to seek quick, low-risk resolution. Checking off a small task delivers a tiny, immediate hit of completion. The larger, higher-leverage task offers no such quick reward. It requires tolerating open uncertainty for an extended period, sometimes for weeks, before any payoff arrives at all. Most people are simply not comfortable holding that kind of unresolved tension, so they resolve it artificially by staying busy with something else instead. High performers are not immune to this discomfort. They feel the same pull toward easy, safe motion that everyone else feels. The difference is that they have trained themselves to recognize the pull and tolerate it anyway. They have learned, often the hard way, that the anxiety of committing to the important, uncertain task is temporary, but the cost of avoiding it compounds silently for months. This tolerance is not a personality trait people are born with. It is closer to a skill built through repetition. Every time someone chooses the important, uncertain task over the easy, safe one, and survives the discomfort of not knowing how it will turn out, that tolerance grows slightly stronger. Every time someone avoids it and hides in busyness instead, the avoidance pattern gets slightly more reinforced. Small choices, repeated daily, quietly build either a habit of leverage or a habit of hiding. This reframes the entire question of productivity. It is not primarily a scheduling problem. It is an emotional regulation problem wearing a calendar's clothing. The person who says, "I just don't have enough hours," is very often describing something else entirely. An unwillingness, usually unconscious, to sit with the exposure that comes from picking the few things that matter and letting everything else go undone. Once this becomes visible, busyness stops looking like an accident of circumstance. It starts looking like a strategy, even if nobody consciously chose it. And if it is a strategy, however unconscious, it can be examined, questioned, and eventually replaced with a different one. That replacement begins with understanding exactly what high performers have learned to tolerate that most people have not, which is where the next insight begins. There is a second layer beneath the exposure avoidance pattern, and it explains why this dynamic is so hard to break, even once someone understands it intellectually. It has to do with identity, not just emotion. Most people build their sense of self-worth, at least partly, around the idea of being hardworking. This identity forms early, often through praise received as a child or young employee for effort rather than results. "You worked so hard on that. I can always count on you to put in the hours." These are warm, well-meaning statements, but they quietly train a person to associate their value with visible exertion, not with outcomes. Once that association is set, busyness becomes something deeper than a scheduling habit. It becomes proof of identity. Being busy confirms, moment to moment, "I am someone who works hard, therefore I am someone of value." This is an incredibly seductive trade because it requires no external validation of actual results. The feeling of being slammed is available immediately, every single day, regardless of whether anything meaningful got accomplished. Results, on the other hand, are slow, uncertain, and often judged by other people on their own timeline, not yours. This is the psychology almost nobody names directly. Busyness is not just a way of avoiding hard decisions. It is a way of feeling valuable without waiting for proof. High performers have usually gone through a specific, often uncomfortable transition here. At some point, many of them discovered that their busiest, most exhausting seasons were not their most successful ones. This realization tends to arrive as a genuine shock because it contradicts a belief they had held since childhood. The quarter they worked the latest nights sometimes produced the weakest results of their career. Meanwhile, a stretch where they worked fewer hours but on one carefully chosen priority produced the biggest leap forward they had ever experienced. That contradiction forces a choice. Either the effort equals worth identity is wrong, or the results were simply bad luck. Most people, understandably, choose the second explanation because it protects the identity they have spent years building. High performers, whether through mentorship, hard experience, or sheer necessity, are more often forced to accept the first explanation. And once that identity cracks, something shifts permanently in how they operate. This is the deeper mental model beneath everything discussed so far. Call it the leverage filter, and it works by asking two questions of any task before committing real time to it. First question, does this action move the outcome I actually care about, not just the outcome that feels urgent right now? Second question, could someone else or some system do this instead of me? If the honest answer to the first question is no, the task is motion, not leverage, regardless of how important it feels in the moment. If the honest answer to the second question is yes, the task may still be necessary, but it does not require you specifically, and holding on to it anyway is often ego, not strategy. Picture two people facing an identical workload. Path A responds to everything as it arrives, treats every request with equal urgency, and ends the day exhausted, having touched dozens of things but advanced almost nothing that will matter in 6 months. Path B runs every incoming demand through the leverage filter before reacting. Most of it fails the filter immediately. It gets delegated, delayed, declined, or simply ignored. What remains is a much shorter list, but every item on it is something that only they can do, and something that genuinely moves the outcome they are working toward. Path B looks from the outside like doing less. In a narrow sense, it literally is doing less. But it is doing less of what does not matter, in order to do more of what does. Over a long enough timeline, this is not a small advantage. It compounds into an enormous gap between two people who started with identical hours in the day. Why does Path B consistently win? Because outcomes are rarely the sum of everything you did. They are almost always the product of a small number of decisive actions, with everything else acting as noise around them. A single, well-negotiated deal, one carefully built relationship, one piece of work done at an exceptional level, will often outweigh 100 smaller efforts combined. High performers have internalized this asymmetry. Most people have not, and continue treating every task as though it contributes equally to the final result. This is the principle almost nobody sees clearly, even when it is explained to them directly. Effort is not what compounds. Leverage is what compounds. Hours spent do not stack neatly into results. A small number of correctly chosen actions, repeated and protected fiercely from distraction, produce almost all of the outcome, while the rest of the busy, well-intentioned activity mostly just consumes the day without moving anything forward. Understanding this changes the emotional experience of work itself. It is no longer enough to ask, "Did I work hard today?" The more useful, more uncomfortable question becomes, "Did I work on the right thing today?" That single substitution, asked consistently, is the beginning of the practical shift explored next. Not managing your time better, but managing what counts as real work in the first place. Once someone accepts the leverage filter intellectually, a new problem appears almost immediately. Knowing the difference between motion and leverage is not the same as being able to act on that difference under real pressure. This is where most attempts at change quietly fail, and it deserves honest examination. Here is the difficulty. In any given moment, urgency speaks louder than importance. A message notification, a colleague standing at your desk, a meeting invitation with a red flag attached, all of these create an immediate physiological pull toward response. Importance, by contrast, rarely announces itself with urgency. The task that will matter most in a year almost never comes with a flashing notification. It simply sits there, quiet and easy to postpone, waiting for someone to choose it deliberately. This creates what might be called an attention mismatch. The nervous system is built to respond to immediate signals, not long-term value. This made excellent sense for most of human history, when an immediate signal usually meant an immediate threat. It makes far less sense in a modern environment where the immediate signal is usually just an email, and the long-term value is sitting untouched in a document nobody opened today. High performers have not solved this mismatch by having stronger willpower in the moment. Willpower used moment to moment is an exhausting and unreliable resource. Instead, they have solved it earlier, before the moment of temptation ever arrives. This is the psychological shift worth naming directly. High performers make their important decisions in advance, at a time when they are calm, rather than in the moment, when they are reactive. Consider how this plays out practically. Someone using the leverage filter in real time under pressure has to consciously stop, evaluate a new request against their actual priorities, and decide whether it deserves their attention. That is a lot of cognitive work to do dozens of times a day, and it depletes quickly. By the afternoon, most people simply stop doing it and default back to reacting to whatever is loudest. High performers instead do this evaluation once in advance and turn the result into a standing decision. They decide ahead of time and without any specific request in front of them what categories of work deserve their full attention this quarter and what categories do not. When a new request arrives, they are not deciding from scratch whether it matters. They are simply checking it against a decision they already made calmly, days or weeks earlier. This removes almost all of the moment-to-moment willpower requirement because the hard thinking already happened. This is worth naming clearly, because it explains something that otherwise looks like superhuman discipline from the outside. It is not that high performers resist distraction better in the moment. It is that they have already decided, ahead of time, what counts as a distraction, so there is nothing left to resist. The decision has already been made. A trader once described this exact pattern without realizing she was describing a broader principle. She noticed that whenever she walked into a decision without having thought it through beforehand, the decision took far longer, and she second-guessed herself under pressure. But on the days when she had quietly rehearsed a decision in advance, thought through the scenario before it happened, the actual moment of decision became almost instant. She was not learning anything new in the room. She was simply executing a decision she had already made somewhere calmer. This single distinction between deciding in the moment and deciding in advance explains much of the psychological gap between busyness and leverage. Busy people make almost all of their decisions reactively, under pressure, dozens of times a day, which is exhausting and produces inconsistent results. High performers make far fewer decisions overall because most of the small ones were already resolved in advance by a standing rule, freeing enormous mental capacity for the handful of decisions that genuinely require fresh judgment. Most people miss this entirely because it looks from a distance like high performers simply have fewer demands on their time. That is rarely the true difference. High performers usually face just as many incoming requests as anyone else. What differs is how many of those requests require an actual effortful decision in the moment. For most people, nearly everything does. For high performers, almost nothing does, because the filtering happened earlier, while they were calm enough to think clearly. This has a name worth remembering: decision rehearsal. Rather than waiting for a decision to arrive under pressure and improvising a response, high performers imagine likely scenarios in advance, decide how they will respond, and then simply execute that pre-made decision when the moment actually arrives. This is not the same as rigid planning that ignores new information. It is closer to preparing the emotional and cognitive terrain in advance, so that when a real decision arrives, it does not have to be built from nothing. This reframes the entire emotional experience of a demanding day. Instead of feeling like a series of small, exhausting battles against distraction, the day becomes a sequence of pre-decided checkpoints, most of which require no real effort at all. The energy saved from this shift is not small. It is often the entire difference between a day that feels depleting and a day that feels demanding but sustainable, which is exactly the psychological terrain high performers have learned to build for themselves. There is another piece of psychology beneath all of this, and it explains why busyness feels almost addictive once someone falls into it. It has to do with what the mind experiences as progress. The human brain is wired to seek completion signals. Finishing a task, however small, triggers a small release of relief and satisfaction. This is not a character weakness. It is a basic feature of how motivation works. The problem is that this system cannot distinguish between finishing something trivial and finishing something meaningful. A completed email and a completed year-defining project register in the moment as roughly the same kind of relief. The brain rewards completion, not significance. This creates an uncomfortable incentive. If you want to feel productive today, the fastest, most reliable way to generate that feeling is to complete a large number of small, low-stakes tasks. Clearing an inbox to zero produces a rush of completion signals in a short window of time. Working for 3 uninterrupted hours on one difficult, uncertain problem produces exactly one completion signal, much later, and only if the effort actually succeeds. Given the choice between many small hits of relief and one large, delayed, uncertain hit, most brains will quietly choose the many small ones almost every time without any conscious decision being made. This is the trap almost nobody names directly. Busyness is not just an avoidance strategy or an identity habit. It is also, quite literally, more rewarding to the nervous system in the short term than leverage is. This is why willpower alone rarely fixes the problem. You are not fighting laziness. You are fighting a completion reward system that is working exactly as designed, just pointed at the wrong targets. High performers have not eliminated this reward system. Nobody can. Instead, many of them have learned to redesign their environment so the reward system fires in response to the right kind of progress, not just any progress. This usually looks like breaking one large, uncertain, high-leverage task into a small number of visible checkpoints, so that meaningful work also generates completion signals along the way, instead of asking the brain to wait weeks for a single payoff. Consider how this shows up in something as ordinary as writing a difficult report. Most people either avoid starting it entirely because the size of the task offers no quick reward, or they procrastinate by clearing smaller tasks first, telling themselves they are getting ready to start the real work. A person using this checkpoint approach instead defines a small, concrete first section, treats finishing that section as a genuine completion event, and lets that small hit of relief carry them into the next section. The task has not become easier. The reward structure around it has simply been rebuilt to match how motivation actually works, rather than fighting against it. This connects directly back to the earlier idea of decision rehearsal. Just as high performers decide in advance what counts as important, they also decide in advance what will count as a completion signal along the way, rather than waiting for the entire project to finish before allowing themselves any sense of progress. This is a subtle shift, but it explains why some people can sustain long, uncertain, high-leverage projects for months without burning out, while others abandon similarly important work after a few days, precisely because it never delivers that quick sense of relief that busyness offers so reliably. Most people think this is a matter of stamina or discipline. It is closer to reward design. Someone who quits a high-leverage project after 3 days is not necessarily lazy or weak. They are very likely operating with a reward system that has never been trained to tolerate delayed completion, because their days have always been structured around the abundant, immediate relief that small tasks provide. This also explains why removing busyness cold turkey rarely works and often backfires. A person who suddenly clears their calendar to focus on what matters frequently finds themselves more anxious, not less, because the immediate stream of small completion signals has vanished, and the delayed, uncertain payoff of the important work has not arrived yet to replace it. Without a bridge between the two, most people quietly drift back to busyness within a week, not out of weakness but because the nervous system is genuinely uncomfortable, operating without any completion signal for an extended stretch. The real shift, then, is not simply doing less. It is deliberately re-engineering what completion feels like, so that meaningful work provides enough of its own quiet reward along the way to compete with the easy, abundant reward that busyness has always offered. This is not a mindset. It is closer to a design structure, and it sets up the final piece of psychology worth understanding before turning to practical application. How identity itself must shift, from someone who is judged by visible effort to someone who is judged and who judges themselves by outcomes instead. There is one more psychological shift that separates high performers from everyone else, and it may be the most uncomfortable one to accept. It is a change in what you allow to define your worth on any given day. Most people, without realizing it, use effort as their internal measure of a good day. Did I work hard? Did I stay busy? Did I do my best with what came at me? These questions feel reasonable, even virtuous. They are also, quietly, the wrong questions, because they measure something that does not reliably predict whether anything important happened. High performers tend to replace this internal measure with a much less comfortable one. Instead of asking whether they worked hard today, they ask whether they worked on the right thing today. This sounds like a small linguistic difference. It is actually a complete change in identity, because it removes the easy, always available comfort of effort as proof of worth, and replaces it with something far less forgiving: outcomes, and the judgment of whether today's effort actually moved toward one. This shift is uncomfortable for a specific reason. Effort is fully within your control. You can always work hard, regardless of circumstance. Outcomes are not fully within your control. You can choose the right priority, execute it well, and still fail, because markets shift, people change their minds, or timing simply does not cooperate. Measuring yourself by effort protects you from that uncertainty. Measuring yourself by whether you worked on the right thing exposes you to it directly. This is why so many capable people quietly resist this shift, even after understanding it intellectually. It is genuinely safer, emotionally, to say, "I worked incredibly hard today," than to say, "I am not sure I worked on the right thing today, and I will not know for certain for months." The first statement offers immediate, unconditional comfort. The second offers honesty, but no guaranteed reward. High performers have made a specific trade here, often without framing it explicitly. They have accepted more uncertainty about whether any single day counts, in exchange for a much higher probability that their weeks and months, taken together, actually move somewhere meaningful. This is a trade most people never consciously make, because it requires giving up a daily source of comfort that busyness has always reliably provided. Consider what this looks like in practice. A person operating from the effort-based identity ends a long day exhausted, having answered every message, attended every meeting, and completed a long list of small tasks. They feel satisfied because the effort was real and visible. A person operating from the outcome-based identity might end an identical day having done far less in volume, having spent most of it thinking, deciding, or working carefully on one uncertain, high-stakes piece of work. They may feel less immediate satisfaction because the payoff has not arrived yet and may not arrive for weeks. But 6 months later, the gap between these 2 days, repeated across an entire year, becomes enormous. This is the principle almost nobody sees because it requires tolerating discomfort in the short term for an advantage that only becomes visible much later. Busyness offers daily emotional proof. Leverage offers delayed, uncertain proof, but of something that actually compounds. There is a further layer to this shift worth naming. Once someone stops measuring themselves by effort, they also stop needing other people to witness that effort. This matters more than it sounds. A large amount of busyness is quietly performed for an audience, whether a boss, a team, or simply an internalized sense of what a hardworking person looks like. Long hours visible to others, instant responses that colleagues can see, a calendar that looks impressively full to anyone glancing at it. Once outcomes become the real measure, this audience becomes far less relevant because a quiet, invisible hour spent thinking clearly cannot be performed for anyone and does not need to be, if the only thing that matters is whether it produced something real. This is often the final, hardest transition. It requires becoming comfortable looking from the outside like you might be doing less or working less hard than people around you who are still optimizing for visible motion. High performers accept this discomfort because they have already seen, often more than once, that the visible motion rarely correlated with the actual results, while the quiet, carefully chosen work consistently did. This sets up the practical question that matters most now. If effort is not the right measure and leverage is, how does someone actually restructure a real day full of real demands around this different standard? That question is where the shift moves from psychology into practice, and it begins with a simple, repeatable filter applied before anything else gets decided. Before moving into practical application, one more piece of psychology deserves attention, because it explains why even people who fully accept everything discussed so far still struggle to change their daily behavior. It has to do with how the mind handles competing priorities under social pressure. Here is the difficulty. Choosing leverage over motion is easy in theory, sitting alone with a notebook, thinking calmly about priorities. It becomes far harder the moment another person is involved, because declining a request, even a low-value one, carries a social cost that completing it does not. Saying yes to an unnecessary meeting feels free in the moment. Saying no requires an uncomfortable, immediate interaction, even if the long-term cost of saying yes is far higher. This creates a systematic bias. Costs that are social and immediate get weighted far more heavily than costs that are strategic and delayed. A person will often accept a meeting that quietly costs them 2 hours of high-leverage time, simply to avoid the 10 seconds of discomfort involved in declining it. Multiply this small decision across a week, a month, a year, and the total cost becomes enormous, even though no single instance felt significant at the time. High performers have not solved this by becoming naturally comfortable with confrontation. Most have simply built structures that remove the need for an in-the-moment social negotiation at all. This connects directly back to decision rehearsal. Rather than deciding in real time whether to accept a given meeting or request, they have pre-decided general categories of what does and does not deserve their time, and they lean on that standing decision rather than negotiating fresh each time. This removes much of the social friction because the response becomes a policy, not a personal judgment made in the moment about that particular person or request. There is a second layer here worth naming. Many people unconsciously equate declining a request with declining the person who made it. This blurs an important distinction. It is entirely possible to decline a task while fully respecting the person asking for it. High performers tend to separate these two things clearly. The task can be declined, delayed, or redirected, without the relationship being damaged at all, provided the decline is communicated with genuine respect rather than dismissiveness. This distinction matters because a great deal of unnecessary busyness exists purely to avoid an imagined relational cost that in reality rarely materializes. Most requests, when declined clearly and respectfully, produce far less friction than the anxious anticipation beforehand suggested they would. The anticipated cost of saying no is almost always larger in the mind than the actual cost of saying no turns out to be in reality. Bringing these psychological threads together now completes the picture behind the leverage filter introduced earlier. Busyness persists not because people are undisciplined, but because it protects them from decision exposure, satisfies an identity built around visible effort, delivers a more immediate reward to the nervous system, and avoids the social friction of decline. All four forces point in the same direction, and all four quietly reward motion over leverage, even in genuinely capable people who understand intellectually that leverage matters more. This is why simply telling someone focus on what matters rarely produces lasting change. It addresses none of these four underlying forces. Real change requires each one to be addressed directly, replacing moment-to-moment decisions with pre-made standing rules, redefining what counts as identity-confirming work, rebuilding what counts as a completion signal, and separating the task from the relationship when declining something. Once these four forces are named and understood, busyness stops feeling like a mysterious, unbeatable habit. It becomes a predictable pattern with four specific pressure points, each of which can be addressed with a specific, practical countermeasure. This is precisely where high performers differ most clearly from everyone else. They have not eliminated these psychological pulls. Nobody can. They have simply built specific counterstructures against each one, so that leverage, rather than motion, wins by default, without requiring constant willpower in the moment. This is the bridge into the final practical section of this exploration. Understanding why busyness happens is necessary, but it is not sufficient on its own. The remaining question is how to actually build a day, structured in advance, that routes attention toward leverage automatically, rather than requiring a fresh, exhausting decision every single time something demands your attention. That structure is what separates understanding this principle from actually living inside it, and it is where the focus turns now. Understanding why busyness happens changes how you see your day. It does not by itself change what you do tomorrow morning. This is where most people stall. They finish a book, a talk, or an insight like this one, feel a genuine sense of clarity, and then walk directly back into the same reactive pattern the very next day, simply because nothing concrete was built to hold the new understanding in place. The practical shift begins with a single change in sequence. Most people decide what matters at the same moment they encounter a demand on their time. A request arrives, and in that instant, they must simultaneously evaluate its importance and respond to it. High performers separate these two moments entirely. They decide what matters in advance, during a calm, protected window, completely disconnected from any specific incoming request. Only afterward do they measure new demands against a decision that has already been made. This is the practical form of the leverage filter. Once a week, ideally at the same low-pressure time, the question is asked directly, what is the smallest number of actions that, if completed this week, would move the outcome that matters most? Not the longest list of things that could plausibly help, The smallest number of things that only you can do that directly move the result you actually care about. For most people, when they are honest, this number is startlingly small. Often 2 or 3 items, rarely more than 4 or 5, even in a demanding role. Everything else that arrives during the week gets measured against this short list, not against how urgent it feels in the moment. A request that does not touch any of the 2 or 3 priorities gets delegated, declined, delayed, or simply allowed to disappear on its own, which most demands quietly do if nobody chases them. A request that clearly touches one of the priorities gets full attention, protected time, and genuine focus, because it has already passed the filter that matters. This reframes the calendar itself. Most people build their schedule around whatever requests arrive, in whatever order they arrive, and treat the resulting week as something that simply happened to them. High performers build their schedule the opposite way. They block the time for the 2 or 3 high-leverage priorities first, before anything else fills the week, treating that time as a fixed appointment with themselves that is at least as protected as a meeting with an important client. Everything else, all the smaller demands, gets fit into whatever time remains rather than the reverse. This single reordering, protecting the important time first instead of last, is one of the most consistently underestimated practical shifts available. Most calendars fill from the top down, in the order requests arrive, until no time is left, at which point the 2 or 3 things that actually matter get pushed to whenever there's a gap that for most people never quite arrives. There is a second practical tool worth naming clearly here, the delegation question introduced earlier as part of the leverage filter. Before accepting any task personally, a genuine pause to ask, could someone else or some existing system handle this instead of me? This question is uncomfortable for many capable people because it can feel like admitting the task is beneath them, or worse, that they are avoiding responsibility. In practice, it is neither. It is simply an honest audit of where your specific judgment is actually required versus where your involvement is a habit rather than a necessity. A leader once realized, almost by accident, that she was personally reviewing every document her team produced before it went out, a habit that had started years earlier when the team was smaller and less experienced. Running the delegation question against this habit revealed something uncomfortable. The review had become reflexive, not necessary. The team had long since developed the skill to catch their own errors, but the habit of her personal review had never been re-examined. Removing it freed several hours a week, hours that shifted directly into the 2 or 3 priorities that actually required her judgment. This illustrates something important about applying the filter honestly. Many tasks that once genuinely required your involvement quietly stop requiring it, while the habit of doing them personally continues long after the original justification disappeared. Revisiting old habits with fresh eyes on a regular schedule catches this drift before it silently consumes years of high-leverage time. The practical shift, taken as a whole, is simple to state and genuinely difficult to sustain. Decide what matters in a calm moment, protect time for it before anything else fills the week, and measure every new demand against that decision rather than against how loud or urgent it feels. This alone accounts for much of the gap between people who stay busy and people who consistently produce outcomes that compound. Once the weekly priorities are set and protected, a second layer of practical structure becomes necessary, because knowing the priorities in advance does not automatically protect them once the week actually begins. This is where the 4 psychological forces discussed earlier, decision exposure, identity, reward timing, and social friction, show up again in daily form, and each needs a specific, practical countermeasure. The first countermeasure addresses decision exposure directly through what might be called a standing response, rather than a fresh decision each time. Instead of evaluating each new request individually under pressure, a small number of general categories are decided in advance. Meetings without a clear decision to be made get automatically declined or shortened. Messages that do not touch one of the 2 or 3 weekly priorities get answered in a single batch, once or twice a day rather than continuously throughout it. This removes dozens of small, exhausting judgment calls, replacing them with a policy that was decided once, calmly, and simply gets applied repeatedly. The second countermeasure addresses the identity shift discussed earlier and it is more of a language habit than a structural one. At the end of each day, instead of asking, "Did I work hard today?" the question becomes, "Did I move one of my 2 or 3 priorities forward today?" This single substitution, repeated daily, slowly retrains the internal measure of a good day away from effort and toward outcome. It feels uncomfortable at first, precisely because it removes the easy, unconditional comfort that effort-based measurement always provided. Over time, though, it becomes the more honest and more motivating question because it actually tracks something real. The third countermeasure addresses the reward timing problem by deliberately building small, visible checkpoints into any large, high-leverage task rather than waiting for the entire project to finish before allowing any sense of progress. A high-leverage priority that will take 6 weeks to complete gets broken into a small number of milestones, perhaps one every few days, each of which is treated as a genuine, worth-acknowledging completion, not just an internal checkbox. This gives the nervous system something to work with in the near term, rather than asking it to tolerate 6 full weeks of uncertainty before any relief arrives. The fourth countermeasure addresses the social friction of declining requests, and it is largely about separating the task from the relationship clearly, out loud, rather than leaving that distinction unspoken. A direct, respectful decline, paired with a brief acknowledgement of the relationship itself, tends to land far better than most people expect. Declining a request does not require declining the person, and saying so explicitly usually removes most of the anticipated friction before it has a chance to build. Taken together, these 4 countermeasures form a repeatable daily structure, a short list of protected priorities decided calmly in advance, a standing policy for everything else, so most decisions never require fresh judgment, a daily question that measures outcome instead of effort, visible checkpoints built into long, uncertain work so progress can be felt along the way, not just at the very end, and a clear, respectful way of declining tasks that separates the request from the relationship. None of these 4 pieces are complicated on their own. What makes them powerful is that they work together, each one addressing a different force that would otherwise quietly pull attention back toward busyness. Remove any single one, and the others still help. But the pullback toward motion becomes noticeably stronger, because whichever force was left unaddressed continues operating in the background exactly as it always has. This is also why the shift tends to feel harder in the first few weeks than it does later. Early on, every one of these 4 countermeasures requires conscious effort, because none of them are habits yet. A standing policy has to be actively remembered and enforced. The daily outcome question has to be deliberately asked, because the effort question still arrives first, out of long habit. Checkpoints have to be manually built into projects that previously had none. Declines have to be practiced, awkwardly at first, until they start to feel routine rather than confrontational. This effort is temporary, though, in a very specific sense. Each of these 4 countermeasures becomes progressively more automatic with repetition in exactly the same way that the original busyness pattern became automatic through years of repetition in the opposite direction. The goal is not to rely on willpower indefinitely. The goal is to repeat this structure consistently long enough that leverage, rather than motion, becomes the new default, requiring no more conscious effort to maintain than busyness once required to sustain. There is one final piece worth addressing directly, because it is the objection almost everyone raises the first time they seriously consider this shift. What happens to all the small tasks that genuinely do need to get done, the ones that will not simply disappear if ignored? Rent still has to be paid. Emails from a direct manager still need a response. Not every task can be delegated or declined, no matter how honestly the filter is applied. This is an important distinction, and it is worth being precise about it. The leverage filter was never meant to eliminate small, necessary tasks entirely. It is meant to stop those tasks from silently expanding to fill the entire day, crowding out the 2 or 3 priorities that actually compound over time. Necessary maintenance work still exists, and high performers still do it. The difference is where it sits in the structure of the day, not whether it exists at all. Most people let maintenance work fill however much time it demands, then fit the important priorities into whatever time is left over, which is usually very little by the time the maintenance work is done. High performers reverse this order. The 2 or 3 priorities get their protected time first, early in the day or early in the week, before energy and attention have been spent elsewhere. Maintenance work then gets batched into a specific, contained window, often at a predictable time each day, rather than being allowed to interrupt continuously throughout it. The tasks still get done. They simply stop being allowed to dictate the shape of the entire day. This containment is itself a practical skill, distinct from the priority setting discussed earlier. It usually looks like designating a fixed block, perhaps 30 to 60 minutes once or twice a day, for the smaller, necessary responses that do not touch the main priorities. Outside of that window, those tasks wait. This feels uncomfortable at first, particularly for anyone who has built an identity around instant responsiveness. But the discomfort fades quickly once it becomes clear that very few things genuinely require an instant response, and the ones that do are rare enough to be handled as clear exceptions, not as the default mode of an entire day. This also reframes what urgent actually means in most professional contexts. Something is truly urgent if a short, specific delay causes a real, meaningful consequence. Very little that arrives through a normal inbox or messaging platform meets that bar, even though almost all of it is labeled implicitly or explicitly as though it does. Recognizing the gap between labeled urgency and actual urgency is often enough on its own to reclaim a surprising amount of protected time each week. Bringing all 3 insights together now completes the full picture. Busyness and leverage feel identical from the inside, but produce entirely different outcomes because one optimizes for visible motion and the other optimizes for the small number of actions that actually move results. This confusion persists because busyness quietly protects people from decision exposure, confirms a comfortable effort-based identity, delivers faster rewards to the nervous system, and avoids the social friction of decline. And the practical shift out of this pattern is not about working less in some vague sense. It is about deciding in advance and in a calm moment what the few real priorities are, protecting time for them before anything else fills the week, containing necessary maintenance work into its own bounded space, and measuring each day by whether it moved something real rather than by how full or exhausting it felt. This is the shift high performers have made, often quietly, often without ever naming it explicitly the way it has been named here. They are not working harder than everyone else. In many cases, they are working less, in volume, than people who are still optimizing for motion. What they have changed is the filter applied before anything makes it onto the day at all, and that single change, compounded across months and years, accounts for far more of the gap between busy people and effective people than talent, luck, or resources ever could. Busyness and productivity were never the same thing, even though they feel identical while you are living inside them. One measures motion, the other measures leverage, and the gap between them is not built from a single dramatic decision, but from a filter applied quietly over and over, choice by choice, until it becomes the way a person simply operates. The pattern is now visible. Busyness protects you from decision exposure, confirms a comfortable identity built on effort, delivers faster rewards to a nervous system that craves quick completion, and avoids the small social friction of saying no. None of these forces make busyness a failure of character. They make it a deeply human, deeply reasonable response to uncertainty, one that almost everyone falls into, because the alternative asks for something harder. Choosing a small number of things that matter, protecting them fiercely, and living with not knowing for a while whether the choice was right. That is the trade high performers have made. Not more hours, not more talent. A different filter, applied before the day ever starts, deciding in a calm moment what deserves full attention, and measuring everything else against that decision rather than against how loud it sounds in the moment it arrives. The core principle underneath all of it is simple enough to carry forward from here. Effort does not compound. Leverage does. 100 small, urgent tasks rarely add up to anything that changes a year. A handful of correctly chosen actions, protected and repeated, almost always do. You already know more clearly now than before which of your own hours are motion and which are leverage. The only question left is which one you choose to protect first tomorrow morning, before the day has a chance to choose for you.